In a land marked by conflict and dreams of sovereignty, there's a saying that echoes through the streets and hearts of many Palestinians: Hamas, until liberation and victory. This expression captures the fervor and resolution of Hamas, an organization committed to the Palestinian cause but regarded by many around the world as a terrorist group due to its methods and actions. This is the history of Hamas. The year is 1987. The Palestinian territories are simmering with discontent. Decades of Israeli occupation have fueled frustrations, and a young movement emerges from the ashes of unrest: Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement. But Hamas wasn't born in a vacuum. Its roots trace back to the Muslim Brotherhood, a pan-Arab Islamist organization founded in Egypt in 1928. The Brotherhood's message of Islamic revival resonated with many Palestinians, and in 1945, a branch called Mujama al-Islamiyah sprouted in the region. Mujama focused on social welfare and religious education, but with the growing Palestinian struggle against Israeli occupation, a more radical faction began to take shape. This is where Hamas comes in. Led by Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, a charismatic cleric, Hamas emerged during the First Intifada, a Palestinian uprising that erupted in 1987. The Intifada was a spontaneous outburst of frustration against Israeli policies. Young Palestinians threw stones, clashed with Israeli soldiers, and refused to cooperate with the occupation. Hamas, with its militant ideology and call for armed resistance, resonated with a segment of the Palestinian population who felt that peaceful protests weren't enough. They believed that armed struggle was the only way to achieve an independent Palestinian state. The Israeli response to Hamas was swift and harsh. Hamas leaders were arrested, and the group was labeled a terrorist organization. But Hamas didn't back down. They continued to organize, recruit fighters, and launch attacks against Israeli targets. The tit-for-tat violence escalated, marking the beginning of a complex and often bloody conflict. This brings us to an essential aspect of understanding the conflict. Hamas's ideology and objectives are deeply rooted in its foundational documents and the historical context of its emergence. The group's ideological framework combines Palestinian nationalism with Islamic fundamentalism, driven by its goal to establish an Islamic state in historic Palestine. The Hamas Charter, originally issued in 1988, lays out its primary objectives and stance towards Israel. The Charter calls for the liberation of Palestine through armed struggle and rejects any peaceful resolution that recognizes the State of Israel. It describes Palestine as an Islamic homeland that cannot be surrendered to non-Muslims, and emphasizing that waging jihad to reclaim this land is a religious duty for all Muslims. In 2017, Hamas released a revised manifesto titled A Document of General Principles and Policies, which made notable changes while maintaining its core objectives. This document, while still rejecting the legitimacy of Israel, accepted the idea of a Palestinian state based on the pre-1967 borders as a temporary solution, reflecting a more pragmatic approach without compromising its long-term goals. The revised charter also attempted to distinguish between Jews and Zionism, focusing its opposition on the Zionist project rather than Judaism as a religion. Hamas's long-term goal remains the establishment of an Islamic state across all of historic Palestine, encompassing present-day Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza Strip. This objective is supported by its social services network and armed wing, the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam Brigades, which conducts military operations against Israeli targets. Now let's explore the militant activities and Israeli conflicts. Hamas has been involved in numerous militant operations since its inception, significantly shaping the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. One of the most infamous attacks was the August 2001 bombing at the Sbarro Pizzeria in Jerusalem, orchestrated by Hamas operative Qais Adwan. This attack resulted in the deaths of 15 people, including 5 children. Adwan, who had a history of recruitment and bomb-making, played a significant role in several other operations before being killed by Israeli forces in 2002. Another major incident was the 2002 Park Hotel bombing in Netanya, which killed 30 people during a Passover Seder. This attack was masterminded by Abbas al-Sayed, who had also plotted to use cyanide in bombings, highlighting Hamas's continuous search for more lethal methods. Assassinations of Hamas leaders. Israel has targeted numerous high-ranking Hamas officials over the years. One prominent figure was Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, the spiritual leader of Hamas, who was killed in an Israeli airstrike in 2004. This assassination led to a surge in retaliatory attacks from Hamas. In 2008, Nizar Rayan, a senior Hamas leader, was killed along with his family in an Israeli airstrike. Rayan was a significant figure advocating for suicide bombings and other militant activities. Similarly, Saeed Sayam, Hamas's interior minister, was killed in 2009, along with several members of his family and other Hamas operatives, in a targeted Israeli strike. Another major conflict occurred in 2014, known as Operation Protective Edge. This war was marked by intense fighting, including ground invasions by Israeli forces and extensive rocket fire from Hamas. The conflict caused a high number of casualties and severe damage to Gaza's infrastructure. Most recently, the October 2023 conflict started with a large-scale attack by Hamas on Israeli territory, involving thousands of rockets and ground incursions. This attack led to a massive Israeli military response, including extensive aerial bombardments and a ground invasion, which resulted in significant loss of life and further deepened the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Next, let's examine the political aspects. After winning the 2006 Palestinian legislative elections, Hamas found itself in a position of significant political power. This victory led to a period of ambiguity regarding its stance towards Israel and the broader political strategy of the organization. In March 2006, Hamas published its government program following its electoral victory. This program asserted sovereignty over Palestinian territories but notably did not reiterate claims to all of mandatory Palestine, a shift from previous rhetoric. Instead, it expressed willingness to engage with Israel on practical matters such as business, trade, health, and labor. The document stated that recognizing Israel was beyond the jurisdiction of any single faction or government, suggesting that such a decision should be left to the Palestinian people through a referendum. Riyad Mustafa, a Hamas MP, clarified on June 6, 2006, that while Hamas would never recognize Israel, it would accept the outcome of a popular referendum that endorsed a peace agreement including such recognition. Ismail Haniyeh, then Prime Minister of the Palestinian National Authority, sent a letter to U.S. President George W. Bush in June 2006 proposing a Palestinian state within the 1967 borders and suggesting a long-term truce with Israel. This overture, however, was met with no response from either the U.S. or Israel. Hamas's evolving stance was further illustrated on June 28, 2006, when it signed the second version of the Palestinians Prisoners document, supporting a Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders and recognizing the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. Despite these political maneuvers, Hamas maintained a hard-line stance in certain contexts. In an August 2006 interview with the New York Times, Haniyeh reiterated Hamas's willingness to accept a Palestinian state within the 1967 borders, but continued to reject formal recognition of Israel. Moving on, from 2008 to 2012, Hamas's political stance remained complex and multifaceted, often articulated through its two key spokesmen, Ismail Haniyeh and Khaled Mashal, each sometimes presenting different nuances. In April 2008, former U.S. President Jimmy Carter met with Khaled Mashal, who expressed willingness to accept a Palestinian state on the 1967 borders if approved by a Palestinian referendum. Despite this apparent softening, Mashal did not agree to a unilateral ceasefire, and the U.S. and Israeli governments largely ignored these overtures. On June 19, 2008, Hamas and Israel agreed to a 6-month ceasefire, which ended its mutual accusations of violations by December 2008. In November 2008, Haniyeh reiterated Hamas's position from 2006, adding that Hamas would accept a Palestinian state within the 1967 borders if Israel recognized Palestinian national rights. Throughout 2009 and 2010, both Haniyeh and Mashal reiterated the possibility of a Palestinian state within the 1967 borders, contingent upon a Palestinian referendum. Haniyeh also added conditions such as the resolution of the refugee issue and the release of Palestinian prisoners. In 2011 and 2012, Hamas and Fatah signed agreements to form a national unity government, although these agreements did not materialize into a lasting political solution. Now remember the 2017 charter we talked about where Hamas released a revised manifesto titled A Document of Greater Principles and Policies? This was the next major movement that happened after the decision for Hamas and Fatah agreements for a national unity government failed. Around 2018, a Hamas finance minister suggested that a long-term ceasefire, hudna, and a two-state settlement were essentially equivalent in Hamas's view. This period saw a mix of rhetoric from Hamas leaders, occasionally calling for the annihilation of Israel while also expressing openness to a Palestinian state within the 1967 borders. In 2021, Hamas organized a conference in Gaza to discuss the management of a future Palestinian state post-Israel. The conference conclusions were controversial, suggesting that Jewish fighters would be killed while peaceful individuals could be integrated or allowed to leave, with highly skilled individuals being prevented from leaving. Now to the present. The most severe military clash since the 1973 Yom Kippur War broke out on October 7, 2023, when Hamas launched a large-scale attack on Israel. This attack involved thousands of rockets and ground incursions, resulting in significant casualties. Hamas leaders made conflicting statements about their policies towards Israel during this period. Ghazi Hamad, a member of the Hamas Political Bureau, described Israel as a country that has no place in their land and called for its removal. On November 1, 2023, Ismail Haniyeh stated that Hamas would be ready for political negotiations for a two-state solution if Israel agreed to a ceasefire and allowed humanitarian aid into Gaza. However, in January 2024, Khaled Mashah reiterated that while a Palestinian state within the 1967 borders could be temporarily accepted, Hamas would not recognize Israel as a legitimate state, maintaining their long-term goal of full Palestinian liberation. Hamas has been designated as a terrorist organization by several countries, including the United States, European Union, Israel, and Canada. This designation is due to its involvement in numerous violent attacks, including suicide bombings and rocket fire targeting Israeli civilians. Since Hamas's October 2023 attack, where it killed at least 1,400 Israeli civilians, this has led to widespread condemnation and accusation of war crimes under international humanitarian law. However, as we know now, Israel as well didn't back down but responded to the attack. Despite being heavily sanctioned, Hamas has managed to fund its operations through a complex financial network. This includes investments in businesses in countries such as the UAE, Turkey, and Qatar, as well as receiving significant financial support from Iran. Efforts to curb Hamas's financial resources involve sanctions from various countries, but these measures have not completely halted the group's ability to raise and move funds globally. What's next for Hamas? The Israeli military is actively seeking to dismantle Hamas, aiming to free the remaining hostages and neutralize the group's military capabilities. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has warned of a prolonged and challenging conflict. By early 2024, the Israeli military had significantly weakened Hamas, rendering it unable to launch rockets into Israel and causing substantial losses among its fighters. Despite these setbacks, Hamas has not conceded to Israeli demands and continues to envision a role in Gaza's future governance. Also, Hamas and the Palestinian Authority have engaged in discussions about forming a technocratic government to administer Gaza after the conflict. However, this proposed cooperation faces skepticism from Israeli officials, who are reluctant to accept any arrangement that might allow Hamas to regroup and continue its activities. The Israeli government has so far rejected temporary ceasefires that could enable Hamas to regain strength. That's all we have for you today on the history of Hamas. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family to view our discussion. Kindly share your thoughts on this ongoing war in the comments section. Thank you.